Hey everybody. I know it's been a while. It's all my fault, but it's Monday night, and that means it's time for Disputed Lands. I really couldn't pick a more perfect guest to come back from a hiatus on than my guest tonight, Derek Gilbert, and I'm really excited to get to him. But we got to do the necessary things here before uh, we get on to that. So I'm going to do, of course, the normal promotions here. The first conference I will be speaking at this year is the One in Messiah conference at Denver, Colorado. That's hosted by, of course, Doug Ham, Doug Krieger, and some of the same guests that were speaking there in 2017, or I think it was 2017. I'm losing track of time, Derek. Last year, I'm just going to say last year, 2017, are there, but we also have some new ones, including some guests all the way from Israel. Are going to be flown in to speak there and tell us about some things that are current on the ground there. We, of course, have the Go Therefore conference. You can find all the links for these on my Facebook page. Uh, but if you just type and search, everybody knows how to use their search bars, right? We don't have to go through that. Just start One in Messiah Conference, Denver, Colorado. You'll find it. The Go Therefore conference, hosted by Mike Spalding of Lima, Ohio. Man, this is a lineup of guests that you really don't want to miss. Mike put together a nice little promotional video. So if you don't like to read, just click the video. It'll tell you all about it. That's 94 days and counting. Then, of course, another one that's right there in Ohio. Man, I tell you what, if you live in the Midwest this year, you are going to be so blessed. There's over 100 speakers within a tri-state area in a few months that are going to be there. And I kid you not, there are over 100 speakers between these two or three conferences. The one in Michigan the month before, you just move to the Midwest. I mean, you'll be much happier. Go to Missouri, where Derek's at, and go to Indiana. I would bypass Illinois right now.
I'm from there, and so would I.
Yeah, I just bypass Illinois, Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky. You'll be all right. Just Michigan is still okay, but I can tell you some things about there. Anyway, 22 days. You only have, folks, a little over 50 days left to get your early bird tickets for the Take on the World. So get in there and get them while it's hot. Tonight's guest, I'm going to tell you all about him. For those of you who don't know, I have a feeling that a lot of you who watch my program will know who this guy is, but I'm going to go through his bio anyway. Derek P. Gilbert hosts A View from the Bunker, one of my first podcasts. I kid you not, I got a podcast player just so I could listen to this podcast. I'd never had a desire to do so. View from the Bunker, one of my favorites. You can go there and find my interview with him that I did last week.
Mhm.
It was a lot of fun. I've gotten a lot of good feedback from that, so thank you very much, Derek, for having me on. He also hosts, of course, SkyWatch TV, the worldwide syndicated. I believe it's worldwide. Anywhere you have access to an internet that's not blocked, you can get SkyWatch TV, a weekly Christian television program, and co-host of Sci Friday, a weekly television program that looks at science news with his wife and author, analyst Sharon K. Gilbert. Derek is a Christian, a husband, and a father, and the author of a plethora of books, groundbreaking books he has here. The Great Inception, Satan's Psyops from Eden to Armageddon. We're going to probably on this program have Derek back to go back and look at some of these other books because I didn't get to them when they came out. I don't even think my show was on when some of these were coming out or just brand new. Last Clash of the Titans, the prophesied war between Jesus Christ and the gods of antiquity. He's also co-authored a book with Josh Peck about the occult origins of the modern UFO phenomenon, The Day the Earth Stands Still. Derek's forthcoming book, the one we're going to be talking about tonight, is called Bad Moon Rising. It's the spiritual forces behind Islam. This is a very important topic for today. It makes daily headlines in a timely book. You guys all know Derek's been a popular speaker, right? He speaks at conferences all over. Every time I turn around, Derek's somewhere else. I'm wondering if he when he's home to do the program because he's always off and running. I know, or I believe you're got an upcoming trip to Israel
Yep.
that you're doing.
We'll
The
be there
guy
in 2
is
weeks.
the guy is just active. He's out there and he's doing ministry. We won't hold against him that he's a Cubs fan. Well, but you can root along with him if you'd like to for the Cubs. Uh, but without further ado, uh, Derek, welcome to the show.
It's an honor to be here, Chad. Thank you.
Man, it's my pleasure. I'm going to screen share here. You guys need to go right away to Amazon. Just type in Bad Moon Rising by Derek Gilbert. You will see his newest book. I love the title of this book for one simple reason, Derek, is that nobody's going to give me about the lengthy title of my own because Doug Krieger, he doesn't do small. And everybody asks, your long title. Well, look at this title, folks. Bad Moon Rising.
We like to joke that Tom Horn comes up with subtitles that could double as the first chapter.
Yeah, Islam, Armageddon, and the most diabolical. Let me try that again, folks. Diabolical double cross in history. It's for 1995, right now, and it's probably a #1 bestseller. If it isn't already, it's headed that way.
Still pre-order. It did, which shocked me. It did hit #1 new release in the Islamic theology category, which was a shock. But it's still on pre-release. It has not arrived from the printer yet, and probably won't for maybe another month. So it's not available yet. But when it does come out, it'll be, of course, available at Amazon. But SkyWatch TV will have a special offer on it with new books forthcoming from Pastor Carl Gallups and Lieutenant Colonel Bob McGinnis. So if your viewers want to hold off for a month or so, I mean, I'm happy. It's ego gratification, I guess, to see it scoring well or doing well in the new release categories in Amazon. But really, it's just about the information getting out there. And I'm glad to see that it's in like Islamic history and Islamic theology categories. But if people really want to help SkyWatch TV and the ministry that we support, which is Whispering Ponies Ranch, and get a better deal because we, being the publisher, as well as SkyWatch TV, can offer a better price than Amazon can offer. So again, you can pre-order at Amazon if you like, but you'll probably get it faster from SkyWatch TV, and you'll get a much better deal at SkyWatch TV. So and because you don't have to pay Amazon their cut, then Whispering Ponies Ranch, which is the ministry that SkyWatch TV supports, gets a better cut of the deal as well. And that's why we do what we do at SkyWatch TV, because that ministry, Whispering Ponies Ranch, and the work with foster children, and now beginning this year with teens who've aged out of the Royal Family Kids program, which is for kids in foster care age 9 through 12. And if you know anything at all about the foster care system, many wonderful people who volunteer their time and serve as foster parents, but statistically, children in foster care are at much higher risk of being drawn into child pornography and prostitution and drug use and gangs and prison, early death, that sort of thing. And our mission at SkyWatch TV is to support that work so that Royal Family Kids don't have to pay anything to bring children to Whispering Ponies Ranch, which is very close to us here in Crane. Call our office if you want to arrange a tour and see the ponies and see what's being done there. But that's our goal, is that what we sell through the SkyWatch TV store supports Whispering Ponies Ranch, so that ministries who bring these children to help them begin to heal by showing them the love of Jesus Christ don't have to pay a dime to bring the kids. It costs money to run a camp, and many of the camps that work with Royal Family Kids have to charge, $500,000 a week per child, and we just don't want any kids to have to stay home because there wasn't enough money. So anyway, that's why we do what we do at SkyWatch TV. But again, I'm just delighted that this book has attracted some attention, 6 weeks before it was even arrives from the printer. And I hope that the information gets out there because, as you mentioned, Chad, this topic is very timely right now, especially after what happened in Sri Lanka on Sunday.
Absolutely. So this is a quick byline to the title. It says that drawing on peer-reviewed academic research, Gilbert, that's you, exposes Islam as a dark allegiance of pagan gods and lays out a scenario of the end times that reveals the bloody role of Islam on the road to Armageddon. And as we've stated, it seems like those words are prophetic, whether they were intended to be or not. But there's a couple of subjects that you've laid out here, Derek, and we're just going to jump right into it. I'm going to start with this first one that you've laid out here is why Islam is the supernatural equivalent of a corporate merger. Now, I'm going to preface this, and then we're going to let you talk. When I was doing the research for my book, and I had come to the conclusions and the subject or the emphasis of the thesis in my book was that the world had fallen under the bondage of Egypt. And to me, this made perfect sense because we saw the plagues that were poured out in Egypt, the 10 of them, were against the gods of the Egyptians. You've already written about this in your book. You go into a lot of details. Of course, this is something that I noticed as well, and I laid out those plagues. But I hold the future return of the Messiah to be a future event, and that this Armageddon and the wars and the things that surround the end times, as written in the book of Revelation, also mention many of the plagues that were found in Egypt, but not all of them. Some of them are disappeared. It's a shorter list, but some of them are the same. And it was kind of a head scratcher for me. I knew that they're against the gods, and it made sense to me because the world has come under the bondage of Egypt. But what happened to these other fellas? And the first title of your book here, I think, is going to answer that question. Why Islam is a supernatural equivalent of a corporate merger. What do you mean by that?
Well, it struck me while preparing a talk about a year and a half ago for the Hear the Watchman conference in Boise, Idaho. And we were there because Mike and Jeannie live near there, but also because that was one of the best places in the country to see the great American eclipse, the solar eclipse, total eclipse.
Oh, yeah.
And I wanted to do something that related to the sun and the moon. And so I started looking into it. Now, many of us Christians have been told for years that the sun god is very important to the occult, that Baal was a sun god and Nimrod was a sun god and so forth. But in the research that I've been doing over the last few years into Mesopotamian religion, the religion of the ancient Akkadians and Sumerians and Amorites, that turns out not to be true. The sun god was sort of a junior member of the pantheon. The moon god was far more important. And so I said, well, no, wait a minute. The moon is covering up the sun here at this. Okay, let me talk about that instead. Well, okay, the symbol of Islam, although Islamic scholars will deny it, the crescent moon has become a de facto symbol of Islam. The imams will say, well, Islam has no symbol. Okay, then what are those on the minarets around the Kaaba in Mecca? How did that come to be?
Right.
When you look at the history of Islam over the last 1,400 years almost, it really began, of course, with Muhammad when he got his revelation around the year 610, began preaching in the year 610. Around the year 622, he moved to Medina and began raiding caravans. That was really the start of Islam. They date their calendar from that year, the Hijrah, when he was kicked out of what they believe was Mecca. We'll talk about that maybe during this conversation. I don't think Mecca was in Arabia.
That's anyway, one of the points we're going to talk about, yes, for sure.
Yeah,
Save that one for later.
But the bottom line is, just to summarize it, rather than rabbit trailing down, which I could do for hours, is this, that Islam is too old, too big, too successful, and continues to grow 1,400 years on for it to be the work of just one ancient deity. We can blame it on Satan, and Satan is a part of this coalition, but he's not the only one. The Bible talks about gods, plural. God in the Bible, Yahweh the Creator, speaks of gods, plural. Psalm 82 is a courtroom scene in which Yahweh condemns these small g gods for ruling unjustly and says that they will someday die like men. So why do we assume that Islam then is just the work of one god, the moon god, or Satan? I argue that it's actually a coalition of the old gods of Mesopotamia who were caught by surprise by the resurrection of Jesus and decided to put aside their differences, and we discussed that a little bit in the book Bad Moon Rising. I mean, they rebelled against their creator. Why wouldn't they fight with each other, right? They put aside their differences and formed a coalition, a sort of conglomerate, to create a religion that would do two things. First of all, make it really, really difficult for every other religion on planet Earth, especially Christians and Jews. But number two, create the end times deception that would lure God's chosen people, the Jews especially, into worshiping their man, the Antichrist, as the Jewish Messiah. And if Christians are still on earth when the Antichrist makes his entrance onto the stage, to deceive Christians into worshiping him and accepting him as the Savior as well.
When you say it's a corporate merger, you are talking about the Mesopotamian little g gods. Do you have any particular little g gods in mind when you talk about a merger that took place? Who do you have in mind with this?
Well, these would be the major gods of the people who lived around ancient Israel, which makes sense. These are the gods that were closest to God's chosen mountain, the Mount of Assembly chosen by Yahweh, which is Zion, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. The gods of the nations around ancient Israel, I believe, have formed this coalition, and I detail them in the book. First and foremost is the one that kind of gets overlooked in when Christians do look into the pagan nations around ancient Israel. They kind of overlook the moon god, except when, okay, yeah, we got this moon symbol up there, but really it's the sun god or it's Satan or these other deities that we want to, it's Nimrod or something. Really, the moon god was far more important in ancient Mesopotamia than we realized and that we've been taught. But when you look at the Bible and you understand what the pagans around ancient Israel, specifically and most importantly, the Amorites, remember when God made his covenant with Abraham, he said his descendants would return from Egypt in the fourth generation because the iniquity, the sin of the Amorites is not yet complete. The Amorites are very important. They controlled the ancient Near East, by which I mean the lands that we know as Israel, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Kuwait, Western Iran, Southern Turkey, Northern Egypt. All of that was under the control of Amorites from the time of Abraham down to the time of David. They set the culture for 1,000 years. In fact, they set it for 2,000 years. Even things like Jesus' triumphal entry when he arrived in Jerusalem on the back of a donkey, that was an Amorite thing. And the Jews, the Sanhedrin, knew what it meant. Soldiers rode on mighty steeds, horses. Kings rode donkeys. That was an Amorite thing. So the Amorites founded Babylon. There is no ethnicity called Babylonian. Those were Amorites. The Canaanites were simply the Amorites who lived in the west, in Lebanon and Israel, Canaan. The moon god to them was really, really important. Hammurabi the Great, the greatest of the Babylonian Amorite kings, credited the moon god called Sin, that's spelled S-I-N, but pronounced Sin, with establishing his dynasty. The Amorite name for the moon god was Yarik. When you read the Bible and realize what the Amorites believed about the moon god, you see that the very first, well, one of the earliest supernatural enemies of God, let's put it that way, after the garden, after Genesis 1 through 3, after the Watchers on Mount Hermon and the Tower of Babel incident, the very first supernatural enemy the Israelites faced on leaving Egypt was the moon god. How do I know this? Well, when they entered the wilderness of, we always read it, wilderness of sin. That's actually the wilderness of Sin. It's the wilderness of the moon god. The book of Exodus says they entered it on the 15th day of the second month. Why did Moses put a calendar reference in there? There are no wasted words in the Bible. It's there because it's important. The 15th day of the month on a lunar calendar, which is how they kept time back in the day. In fact, the Hebrews, the Israelites, the Jews today still keep time on a lunar calendar, as do Muslims. The 15th day of the month on a lunar calendar is the night of the full moon. It's when the moon god, Sin, is at full power. And the book of Exodus tells us it was that night, that day, when they entered the wilderness of the moon god, when the moon god was at full strength, the Israelites began to complain against Moses. Yo, you brought us out here to die. We should have stayed in Egypt. The very next morning, manna began to fall. And it fell every day, well, 6 days a week, didn't fall on the Sabbath, until they crossed the Jordan River 40 years later, which incidentally was just in time for Passover. We'll talk about that in just a minute, why that's important. So they entered the wilderness of the moon god. God begins to feed them. They go to Mount Sinai, which is also based on the name of the moon god, the mountain of the moon god. And that's where Moses met Yahweh. It's where God gave him the law, but it's also where God brought Moses, Aaron, and the 70 elders of Israel up the mountain, and they saw God, and he did not harm them.
Mm-hmm.
And this is shocking because most of us haven't been taught this. Didn't God put Moses in the crevice of the rock and he could only see? Yes, that was the glory of, that was God the Father. But there was a God who could appear in physical form, the captain of the Lord's host, who appeared to Joshua, the Lord on Mount Sinai, who ate a meal with Moses, Aaron's sons, and the 70 elders of Israel on the mountain that was initially called in the book of Exodus the mountain of God, or the mountain of the Elohim. Actually, Har Elohim could also mean mountain of the gods, quite honestly. But it was a mountain devoted to the moon god. That's where Yahweh chose to give the law to Moses, to give him the instructions for the tabernacle, and to bring the 70 elders of Israel up this mountain as a sign, a message to these small g gods that this is what's going to happen someday. Because the Canaanites, the Amorites who lived in the west, believed that their creator God, called El, lived on Mount Hermon with his 70 sons, the gods of the nations. This was Yahweh saying, no, here are my 70. And someday they're coming back up my Mount of Assembly, my Har Moed. This was all directed at the moon god. When they crossed the Jordan River, their first target was Jericho. Well, the Amorite name for the moon god, as I mentioned, is Yarik. When you transliterate from Hebrew to English, the Y becomes a J. Yarik, Jericho. It was the city of the moon god. That was their first target in the Holy Land.
Yeah, so interesting enough, I don't know if you know this. You probably did, or maybe it's in your book, and I don't know that when you take 6, of course they marched around it 6 times, and then the 7th time flowing. But if you take 6 times 360, that's actually the measurement we're given for the moon by science today. I didn't know if you were aware of that. You probably were.
It's not in the book. That's a nice little tidbit that I'll have to steal and use for future presentations.
I think Dr. Michael Lake actually might have used it in this too, but I got that information from David Flynn.
Yes.
So,
well, there's another interesting reason though about this march around the city of the moon god. That kind of ritual circling or circumambulation is a practice that dates back many, many years. The cult of the moon god in Mesopotamia celebrated a festival called the Akitu, Akitu, in the spring and in the fall, and it was usually during the month of the New Year. In fact, it's still there are 2 New Years in the Jewish calendar today. There's a religious New Year and a civil New Year, and the first of Nisan is the New Year, Rosh Hashanah. The Passover is celebrated on the 14th. And the book of Exodus tells us that they began to march around Jericho, or rather, this is the book of Joshua. They began to march around Jericho after celebrating the Passover. So again, it's the 15th of the month. They're marching around the city of the moon god when the moon is at full strength. This is Yahweh demonstrating to his people that his power was greater than that of the false gods, the small g gods worshipped by these pagans. But this ritual circumambulation, as part of the Akitu festival, is known from ancient texts to have begun, scholars believe, at a city in ancient Sumer called Ur. Ur is where the great ziggurat of Ur was located. Saddam Hussein was rebuilding it when we invaded back in, when was it, 2001? Or even earlier, 91. Anyway, the ziggurat of Ur was the temple for the moon god, because the moon god, Sin, was the patron god of the ancient city of Ur. Well, as part of this Akitu festival, they would bring the idol representing the god out to a special house. They would have these rituals and festivals and celebrations. And as part of this, they would march in circles around the fields to raise the hedge of protection around the crops. And then they would bring the god back into the city with great fanfare, the triumphal procession, the triumphal entry, if you will, or re-entry of the god back into the city as he's brought back into his temple. And that always happened on the seventh day. What day after marching around the city of Jericho did the walls collapse?
Mm-hmm.
Day 7. This was the reversal of a ritual that worshipers of the moon god had been doing for 1,000 years in Mesopotamia.
This is why I like doing this research, Derek, and it sounds like why you do too, because you find out these things that help us to make sense in the scripture,
Right.
that seemingly have no place in today's culture, or no
Right.
reason or basis for understanding it. It's in the Bible, good to know, check, move on.
Yeah.
But there's so much more there. There's so much more there.
Absolutely. Well, I'll run through the other gods as part of this coalition here, because I see I'm taking a lot of time on just the one. So the moon god is obviously very important, and that's why I believe the moon god symbol is above the minarets that are over the Kaaba in Mecca. The tower, the big clock tower in Mecca, has a crescent moon on it. It's because this moon god is very ancient and has been worshipped in Mesopotamia for 5,000 years, probably longer. The other gods, and I believe there are 7 main gods. There may be more, but this is, to the best of my ability to discern, the ones that I think are the main players in this coalition. There is the God. This is known to the Sumerians as Enlil, to the Canaanites I mentioned as El, to other groups of Amorites he was called Dagon, also became the chief god of the Philistines later on. The Phoenicians called him Baal Haman. He was called Kronos by the Greeks, Saturn to the Romans. He was the old god who basically rebelled against his father, the sky god, so a primordial god who I believe was a twisted representation of the true God by the pagans. The reason he's called the God is because that's essentially what his name means. Enlil actually has not a Sumerian origin to the name, but a Semitic origin. Il-Ili, meaning God of gods or God of all gods, the God. By the time of Abraham, he'd sort of been demoted to second-tier status, and in many of the pantheons around there, was now relegated to the underworld. And of course, that fits with what we know about Kronos and Saturn from Greek and Roman mythology, a god who had been overthrown by his son, the storm god, and then relegated to the netherworld, to the abyss, to Tartarus. The storm god, of course, is very important. That would be the character called Baal in the Bible. Actually, his name was Hadad, which means thunderer or something like that, known to other cultures as Teshub and Tarhuns and Tarhunta. To the Greeks, he's Zeus. To the Romans, he's Jupiter. But interestingly, when you look at many ancient cultures, even the Indian culture of the Indus River Valley, the Slavic pantheon, the Norse pantheon, Thor, he's the one who emerges as the head of the pantheon when the old god is either overthrown or retires or whatever. The storm god, identified in the Bible in Isaiah 14 as Lucifer, who wants to establish his Mount of Assembly in the uttermost north. And I go into what that actually means in the book. It's actually a reference to a cosmological direction, not a compass point. It's not a reference to Russia or anywhere like that. It points to the mountain that was sacred to Baal, which is a mountain in southern Turkey on the border with Syria. But Jesus identified this character, Baal, as Satan. When the Pharisees accused Jesus of casting out demons by the power of Beelzebul, or Beelzebul, Baal the prince, Jesus linked him with Satan. And then in the Revelation, he referred to Pergamum as the city where Satan dwells. That was the reference to the great altar of Zeus. So
he's also the one that's either often depicted as having only one eye or having lost one eye. You'll see that carried over into our modern movies that way quite often, but in the monument says having only the one eye or the all-seeing eye is the one.
A reference to Odin and Norse mythology especially. So the storm god is another one. The sun god does have a role to play here, and I think the sun god's role in Islam specifically is the legalism. The sun god in ancient Mesopotamia was the lawgiver, and The famous law code of Hammurabi, which was inscribed on a big stone pillar at the top, has a depiction of the sun god Shamash giving the law to Hammurabi the king. Islam, I argue, is nothing if not legalistic. In fact, they twist themselves into knots to make things legal that are really immoral. For example, the concept of the pleasure marriage. Okay. Fornication or adultery is not tolerated. However, there are Muslim scholars who believe that the pleasure marriage was authorized by Muhammad, a short-term contract in which one exchanges for something of value, a short-term marriage with a woman, so you can have relations with her without it being fornication or adultery. That's what we Christians would call prostitution. And to be fair, there are some Muslim scholars who agree, but things like that, which are just basically contrary to biblical standards of morality and righteousness. Thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not commit murder. Under Islam, that's okay. Thou shalt not lie. Well, under Islam, there's a practice, a concept called taqiyya, which makes it okay to dissemble and not tell the truth if it furthers the cause of jihad, furthers the cause of Islam. Often it's used by Shia Muslims, who only make up about 10% of Muslims around the world, in areas where Sunnis are the majority, because Sunnis and Shias hate each other even more than they hate Christians and Jews. So that, I think, is the role of the sun god. There is the goddess, specifically Ishtar or Inanna, also known to us in the West as Aphrodite or Venus. She was the goddess of sex and war, and not marital relations either. We're talking gender fluid, carnal, debased, again, unbiblical relations. Right. And there are examples in the Bible of where her cult, the cult of Inanna, Ishtar, Astarte in the Bible, Astarte, is targeted by God. I mean, King Josiah in his reform around the year 630 AD, or BC rather, when he cleaned out the temple, had to clean out the houses of male cult prostitutes that were inside the Temple of Solomon. Inside the Temple of Solomon, male cult prostitutes who were dedicated to the goddess Astarte, Ishtar, Inanna. I argue that Islam has completely torn apart the definitions, the roles that God, Yahweh, created for men and women in Scripture. Husbands, wives, and the relationship of men, adult men especially, as protectors, fathers and protectors of children. Because sadly, the child abuse is a common thing in areas that are predominantly Muslim. And I relate in the book, Bad Moon Rising, how some American soldiers in Afghanistan wound up getting dishonorably discharged because they took offense at Afghan warlords, Muslim warlords, who were engaging in a practice that, when you translate from Afghan into English, roughly translates as boy play. And it is what you think it is. So but again, under Islam, it's allowed, so it's okay. And because it's not contradicted by the Quran, it's not immoral to engage in this type of behavior. The god of war, of course. I argue that the god of war, Chemosh, the national god of Moab, who later was identified as Ares, the war god of the Greeks, and Mars of the Romans, was also linked, and this is where things get really kind of weird when you're trying to figure out who's who in Mesopotamian gods. Chemosh was identified in that very famous Moabite stone that related the story of Chemosh and his war against Jehoshaphat and the son of Ahab, was equated with a war god called Athtar. Well, Athtar was just the male aspect of the gender fluid goddess of war and sex, Astarte. So at some point around the time of Ahab, this aspect of the war goddess was split into a male personality who was equated with the war god Chemosh, who became Ares and then Mars. But the bottom line is that if we look at the history of Islam over the last 1400 years, it is nothing if not a warlike religion. That is how, in fact, Muhammad began attracting followers. He preached for 10 years, and he attracted about 100 followers, most of whom were his relatives. It was only when they got kicked out of Mecca and run out to Medina that he began, he made caravan raiding, jihad, a holy calling. And suddenly, guys realized, hey, this is a pretty sweet deal, because Muhammad says that Allah says that if we capture these women and capture these the stuff from the caravan, we get to keep all that and do whatever we want with the women and the slaves. And if we die while we're doing it, we get even more slaves and more stuff in paradise. So within 10 years of making that change in the way he evangelized his new religion, Muhammad went from 100 followers to an army that overran all of Arabia. And 10 years after that, it overrun all of the ancient Near East, including Jerusalem, Damascus, Antioch, Alexandria. It was amazing how it works when you tell guys who can swing a sword, hey, our new religion lets you steal whatever you want, take all the women you want, and if you die, you get even more after death. So that's the war god. The plague god is another one, and this is one that's kind of interesting because most people have heard of this god, but they don't think they have. To the Semitic cultures, the Amorites, and to the Hebrews, Israelites, he was called Resheph, and he's mentioned in the Bible a few times. It's just that his name is usually translated plague, as lowercase p, plague. But he was known as a god in the ancient world and had been around for a very long time. He was worshipped at the city of Ebla in ancient Syria. This is near Antioch, around 2500 BC. So 1,000 years before the Exodus, this god was being worshipped in what is now Syria. He was the patron god of the city of Shechem, which is where God appeared to Abraham and reconfirmed his covenant when Abraham arrived in Canaan. It's where It's where Joseph was captured because his brothers were pasturing their flocks at Shechem. And this city that was sacred to this plague god Resheph was where Joshua led the people of Israel immediately after conquering Jericho and its next door city, Ai. He took everybody north to Shechem and put up the altar on Mount Gerizim. These are the mountains of curse and blessing, Gerizim and Ebal, overlooking what is now called Nablus, the Palestinian city in the West Bank. But this was a city that apparently was important enough that God singled it out for that. That's where Joshua put his altar, overlooking this city. Why was Resheph important? Well, plague god, apparently, but also a warrior god. And he was adopted by one of the Egyptian pharaohs as his personal protector. He was considered the special protector of horses and chariots. Well, the pharaoh who adopted him as his personal protector was Amenhotep II, and a Christian scholar by the name of Douglas Petrovich has made a really good case in a scholarly paper that Amenhotep II was the pharaoh of the Exodus. So get that, the pharaoh of the Exodus had as his personal protector a god that had been known as the god of plagues in the ancient world for 1,000 years before the Exodus, and the special protector of chariot warriors. Now, how was Israel freed from Egypt? Through a series of plagues, and then God destroyed Pharaoh's chariots. It's not a coincidence.
Shechem also became the center of worship for the northern 10 tribes. After the split between the northern and southern 10 tribes, Shechem was the most holy mountain or location in the north for those 10 tribes, which marked their boundaries with the cow from the north and the south that was worshipped by the Egyptians as well. That's how they marked their boundaries.
But I would argue that golden calf that Jeroboam put up in the time of Rehoboam, who was the son of Solomon, was a reference to the chief god of the Canaanites, or the god El, because one of his main epithets was Bul El. In fact, in the prophet Hosea writes in condemning that golden calf, he said or wrote that, for it is from Israel, a craftsman made it, it is not God. But the Hebrew is really clunky. It actually translates as literally as from Israel. And a scholar by the name of, forgetting his name is at the moment. Anyway, a specialist in ancient Canaanite religion, said that by regrouping the consonants in Hebrew, because, again, no vowels in ancient Hebrew, you actually come up with this sentence: "For it is Bull El, a craftsman made it. It is not God. It is not Yahweh," in other words. So the bull that he set up at Dan and at Bethel, house of El, temple of El, represented the Canaanite creator god El, not Yahweh. And so there's a little more depth in there. A couple of other places in the Old Testament too, and I kind of go into that here, and also in my previous book, Last Clash of the Titans, about the worship of the chief god of the Canaanites, El, being a little more important than we've been taught. But anyway, those are the 7 gods that I think make up this infernal council of Islam. The God, who, by the way, when you over the centuries, that Il-Ili, that Semitic origin behind the Sumerian god named Enlil, kind of morphed through Akkadian into Arabic as Il-Ilah, became Allah, which just means the God. So even the name of this god that was created by this infernal council and then fed to Abraham, retains the name of the God, or God of gods of the ancient world: El, Enlil, Dagon, Baal Haman, Kronos, Saturn. His name is behind it, although he's still stuck in the abyss, because I believe that character is also identified as the leader of the Watchers, Shemiyaza. So you've got the God, the storm god, who is Satan, the sun god, the moon god, goddess of sex and war, the war god, and then the plague god. But here's the interesting thing about that plague god, Resheph. He's also identified by the Greeks as Apollo, and as the god of plagues, and also considered the gatekeeper to the underworld. That makes Revelation 9 a little more interesting, because it's Apollyon who is called the king of those in the abyss.
Interesting. Man, you're right. You and I could probably spend a day talking about this.
Yeah, I know. We're only 45 minutes in here, and we got...
I would lose track of the whole day trying to get sorted through this. So let me get to the one other thing on this list here that we'll probably end up finishing out the program on: the shocking links between Mount Hermon, Petra, and Mecca. What are the shocking links between these major cities? One major city and one major mountain. And
well, this goes back to what I talked about before: the circumambulation of a space in order to make it sacred, or offer some spiritual protection. In 1869, and I got to give credit to Sharon, who found this as she was doing research for her fictional series, The Red Wing Saga. A British archaeologist and engineer by the name of Charles Warren, Sir Charles Warren, climbed Mount Hermon in September of 1869, and he found... Well, he visited a temple. I mean, the locals knew it was there. It had been visited by a Presbyterian preacher about 10 years earlier. He found a temple on the summit of Mount Hermon called Qasr Antar by the locals. It's the highest man-made place of worship on the planet. And inside that temple, he found something that apparently visitors had missed for 2,000 years, which was a stela. This is a limestone slab about 4 feet high, 18 inches wide, 12 inches thick, and inscribed on it in Greek, which means it probably isn't any older than Alexander the Great's invasion of the Levant, 4th century BC, maybe 350 years before Jesus. By the order of the Most High and Holy God, those who swore an oath proceed from here. Well, who swore an oath on the summit of Mount Hermon? The Watchers. Yeah.
Yeah.
But Sir Charles Warren also found a low stone wall that led up to the summit of Mount Hermon, which was scooped out to receive drink offerings. And this wall forced you to approach it in a spiral pattern with the summit on your left. Well,
counterclockwise.
Exactly,
right.
Counterclockwise. Now, what direction do the people at Mecca circle the Kaaba?
Counterclockwise.
In fact, Sir Charles Warren said this practice called the Tawaf. Is it possible, he said, that this originated on Mount Hermon? And he said it's because the Muslims had a belief that there were stones from a number of sacred mountains, and I may not remember them all, but a number of sacred mountains embedded in the Kaaba, which included the Mount of Olives, Mount Carmel, Mount Ararat, Jebel al-Nur, of course, which was where Muhammad supposedly received his vision, Mount Sinai, and Mount Hermon. And so Warren said, look, why would they include Mount Hermon there unless there was some tradition at Mecca that originated on Mount Hermon, this practice of circling and spiraling into the center, circling a sacred site. Now, here's the connection to Petra. In the 4th century AD, a Christian bishop on the island of Cyprus by the name of Epiphanius was writing a book of apologetics. He was basically condemning the pagan cults that still existed in the ancient world. Okay. By the 4th century, Christianity had been legalized by Constantine, had not yet been made the official religion of the Roman Empire, but it was in that period where Christianity was becoming dominant. And Epiphanius wrote that in Egypt, Alexandria, they had a pagan practice where an idol was brought up from a sacred space below the temple, and they carried it in a procession 7 times around a site before they returned it to its place. And then he said they do the same thing also at Petra. They worship a god born of a virgin called Dushara. Now, Dushara is a local term. It just means Lord of Shara, the Shara Mountains, which is the Seir of the Bible, Seir. It's ancient Edom. The problem is that Epiphanius didn't know his Arabic very well, and he confused a word in Arabic, 2 words in Arabic. He thought that the people, the Arabs, the Nabateans who were worshiping at Petra, were trying to create a copycat religion to the religion of Jesus Christ, a worship of Jesus Christ, who was born of a virgin.
Mm-hmm.
The Arabic word for virgin, and my pronunciation is horrible, I know, but it's Kaaba. But the word he really heard when it was described to him was Kaaba, which means cube.
Right.
And sure enough, when you go to Petra, you will see a number of gods represented in cubes. In fact, the temple of Dushara in the colonnaded street in the main part of Petra, there's a courtyard out in front, and there was a cube in front there. Now, a Canadian scholar by the name of Dan Gibson, a historian who lived for 20 years in Jordan, has produced a documentary film and written a book in which he makes a really good case that the original Mecca was not in Arabia. And there are other historians, scholars, who have pointed out that there is really no evidence to suggest that anything existed in Mecca, in Arabia, prior to the 9th century. Okay, now bear in mind, we're told that Mecca was the home of Muhammad, who was born in 570 AD, had his revelation in the year 610, was kicked out of Mecca around 622 and had to go to Medina. Serious archaeologists who are honest about this will say they can't find anything at Mecca that they can reliably date to before the 9th century. Here's the other thing. There is no text written by a non-Muslim that mentions Mecca before the year 741. Now, by the year 741, the armies of Islam had overrun the entire Near East. All right, everything today from Egypt to Afghanistan had been conquered by the Muslims. They had conquered all of North Africa, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia. They had crossed the Straits of Gibraltar. They'd conquered all of Spain. They'd fought a battle against Charles Martel and the Franks, who turned them back at Tours.
Mm-hmm.
And you're telling me that nobody in Europe had ever heard of Mecca by this point, or until that point? I mean,
right.
The oldest Christian lands on earth, the oldest centers of Christian learning on earth, Alexandria, Jerusalem, Damascus, Antioch. They haven't even besieged Constantinople within 50 years of Muhammad's death. He died in 632. And by the 670s, an Islamic army camped outside Constantinople, which was the capital of what was left of the Roman Empire, for 4 years. And still, no Roman, no European had heard of Mecca. Well, this fellow, Dan Gibson, and the documentary is available at Amazon Prime. It's called The Sacred City. I recommend people watch it. Not to bash Muslims, not to accuse. It's just to make a point, because when you look at the evidence, it really suggests that the original Kaaba, the original cube that was worshipped by early Islam, and the other evidence that fits the descriptions of Mecca in the Quran. By the way, Mecca is only mentioned 2 times in the Quran. Is really at Petra. When we look at how close that is to Jerusalem, And when you look at some other evidence there, that like right there at Petra and in that area is probably where Moses and the Israelites hung out for 40 years before they finally moved north and then crossed over the Jordan River. Spiritually speaking, there's more significance there than there is out in the deserts of Arabia. And Gibson makes a really good case that the only reason it moved was because there was a civil war in Islam in the 680s, and one of the last surviving companions of Muhammad wanted to move the Black Rock and the Kaaba away from the Caliph in Damascus.
Well, there is interesting, and I don't know if it's from that gentleman's research that I had heard interview. That's my problem, is if I don't write it down in notes for something that I know that I may need later, I forget. But they keystones to the temples for Islam are always aligned in the direction of the temple in Mecca. So if you go,
it's called the Qibla, which means direction.
Right, the Qibla,
direction of prayer. Right.
Right. The one, the temple outline that they found there at Petra, where they were trying to claim was this one that was one of their holy ones. But the problem was that the outline, or the Qibla for this temple, didn't align with Mecca.
Well, Gibson actually went and looked at the oldest existing mosques for which he could get reliable measurements. And some of them are still standing. Some of them are just down to the foundations, but they could still identify which wall held the Qibla. And when they checked those, the 12 oldest mosques that still stand, all built within the first 100 years of Islam, none of them point to Mecca.
Right. I'm pretty sure that's exactly where I heard it. It's probably your interview with him on VFTB.
Well, I wanted to interview him, but he's trying to reach out to Muslims, and so he was afraid of being too closely aligned or linked to somebody who's so pro-Israel. So sadly, I have not been able to interview him. I would love to do it. He seems like a really nice guy. I appreciate what he's doing, but I don't think he's going to get. Certainly, he won't get any traction if he gets affiliated with somebody connected to SkyWatch TV, because we're pretty pro-Israel. But
right. Well, let me. Okay, we have about 8 minutes left, Eric, and I'm sorry. We'll just have to have you back on to talk about your other books. That's just all there is to it.
Thank you.
We'll give 8 minutes here to as best as you can, and I know this is not really fair. You can take a little bit longer if you feel so led. Islam's tragic role in the end times. That's a big bite to chew with 8 minutes, and forgive me for giving that to you, but
no, that's all right. I made the
in a breath. Obviously, and I don't think there's anybody that disagrees that Islam has to. I believe we're in those end times. We have to be closer than we were certainly, 50 years ago, by deduction and math, simple math. But just the spiritually speaking, the atmosphere seems to be ripe for trouble. So Islam's tragic role in the end times, it has to play a role. Speculation as to what that role is has started to abound more recently. In your book, what do you see Islam's role is?
I think they're going to be cannon fodder. That's that in a nutshell. I think they're going to be cannon fodder. I believe that Joel Richardson is right on the money with his identification of Mecca and Islam as Mystery Babylon. And I go into that somewhat in Last Clash of the Titans, but I lay it out a little more here in Bad Moon Rising. There are parallels, and again, this gets back to the iniquity of the Amorites. There are parallels in the book of Ezekiel and the book of Revelation. It's pretty clear John the Revelator had read Ezekiel and was led by the Holy Spirit to echo things and expound on things, really, that appeared in Ezekiel. Ezekiel 27, which is a lament over the city Tyre. Well, Tyre was founded by the Phoenicians, who were just descendants of the Amorites. John calls the great end times religion Babylon the Great. Well, Babylon was founded by Amorites, inspired by the moon god to create this occult system that becomes the end times religion. So you've got that parallel there between those two books, which is why I think we're looking at a maritime power. Of course, Revelation makes that pretty clear, and the great maritime power in terms of ocean trade right now is Saudi Arabia, which is the home of Islam, their holiest site. 40% of the world's oil ships across the ocean. Now, there are some who might say, well, look, just recently the United States became the world's leading exporter of oil. Doesn't that mean that this identification doesn't work? No, what I think it means is that the kings of the earth who will kill Babylon the Great, they will kill the Scarlet Woman with the help of the beast, the Antichrist. It shows that once it's served its purpose, it will be sacrificed. It is not indispensable. It is not irreplaceable. That is what I think is going to happen. That when this Antichrist figure arrives on the scene, a war will break out, maybe the Psalm 83 war that Bill Salas has written about, something that will bring to power a dynamic, charismatic, military, political leader who will lead Israel to victory, a huge victory, a smashing victory over its nearest enemies, which will draw in other Muslim nations. This may break down the wall that divides Sunni and Shia as they identify this leader of Israel, because I believe the Antichrist will present himself to the world as a Jew. He won't be a Jew. He will present himself to the world as a Jew. They will identify this character as their Antichrist, the Dajjal. And if we've learned nothing from the civil war in Syria, it's that Muslims all over the world will flock to the battlefield for the honor of doing battle toe-to-toe with what they think is the Dajjal. Mm-hmm. Thing is, they're going to lose, and they're going to lose bad. Their role, as far as the fallen are concerned, and I say this with no joy whatsoever, Muslims are already in their camp. They don't need to work to get them. They've already got them. They want to destroy Israel. They want to destroy Christians. If we're still here on the earth, and I don't even speculate on when the rapture will take place in Bad Moon Rising, if Christians are still here, we may see this character who we think saves Israel from this Muslim coalition as Christ, in the flesh. There are some Christians looking for the manifest Son of God and may see him as the Messiah. Certainly Jews will see this character as the Messiah, Messiah ben Joseph, and then Messiah ben David, the conquering hero who then judges the world. Well, they will realize when he steps into the third temple and declares himself a god that they've been duped. But that's, I think, the role that Islam has to play in the end times, simply as a lure to draw Jews and Christians, if we're here, into worshiping the Antichrist as the Messiah.
That's certainly a lot to think about. I said it before we went on air that I kind of do this out of selfish reasons because I love getting to talk to men like yourself who do the same kind of research.
That's why I've been doing it for 10 years. So
I could probably spend a day with you comparing my notes on the research that I did for my book with yours. And we could probably, not a day, that was probably about a week. It would just get up, have coffee, and we'll go right into the books and start comparing notes and see what we can come up with. But folks, just simply go to, if you can't wait and you want to pre-order the book, you can go to Amazon, or you can wait and you can get the $250 worth of books for $30. SkyWatch TV. When they have their deal later. Derek, it's been a joy to have you on. It's one of those these times in my life. This week, as I count up as things that go on my bucket list that people can't take away from me. I got to be interviewed by Derek Gilbert, and I got the joy of having Derek on my show here. Folks, when it comes to many of these things, and I'm glad you brought that up, the timing of the rapture, you mentioned you didn't even bring it up. There are so many things where in our realm of things, Derek, where people can find things to tear each other down. But what I'm more interested in is looking to see these things that we see in Scripture and finding out what seems to line up, and then having a conversation about it and seeing where it leads us, not where it led you, not where it lead me. Where does it lead us as we confer on these things? And not to fight. He's passionate for the Father. He wants to see people saved. Go find Derek. You can watch SkyWatch TV anytime. They got hundreds of programs down to books. You guys are what, 3 years now? Is it 3 years?
4.
4 years? Oh my gosh. I can remember like it was yesterday. You're going there still, but all right. Well, folks, this has been Disputed Lands. You've been watching here on Monday night. My guest has been Derek Gilbert. Find all the links in the description. I'll have Derek on again. I'll get some of his other books finished. I've started a couple of them and haven't finished them. I'll get them completely read. I'll have him come on and talk about those books when they're 2 years old and 3 years old. But we're going to talk about them anyway, because I believe they still hold relevance. Derek, thanks for being on my program. And until we have you on again, we wish you the best of luck, and we look forward to watching you in the future and seeing what more transpires. Thanks for coming on.
Chad, it's been an honor, and I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
All right. This has been Disputed Lands on Take on the World TV. Go get your tickets, and we'll see you next week. Take care.